when it comes time to understanding very complex and increasingly interconnected issues like the rise of China, maybe, or the fall of other parts of the world and how that impacts markets, how that impacts industry. Naturally, in this podcast, we speak to those who have the most experience, like yourself. So when you look at the landscape of how China has risen over the decades, you have a point of view that says that its rise is unstoppable and the West can't really do anything about it. Am I right in saying that in the first place? And could you just put more meat on the bone with that assumption and what that really means for even Western financial institutions and asset managers and their level of development and growth, especially as China grows and becomes a very dominant power in the future?
Well, that's a very good question. Let's think about China.
Mm-hmm.
China didn't exist in any meaningful way before 2002. So it's 19 years old. It's a teenager still because it joined the World Trade Organization on the, I think it was the 11th of December 2001. So really, it only came to the fore in the early months of 2002. Its currency was pegged to the dollar until 2005. Since then, its currency has, broadly speaking, been strengthening, but has still been held back by Beijing because Beijing is still doing what we saw with West Germany after World War II in Japan, which is trying to remain competitive. The issue is this, is that the People's Bank of China, the SAFE, which is effectively the sovereign wealth fund of China, has learnt all the mistakes that Japan performed when it was the Asian superpower economically. I've been watching China for 19 years, waiting for it to make a mistake, waiting for Beijing to make a microeconomic mistake. And I'm still waiting. It dealt with the 2008 crisis. The 2008 crisis has been described as the GFC, which some call the Great Financial Crisis. It wasn't global. It was purely North Atlantic. It was a crisis that struck the US, a crisis that struck Europe, and a crisis that struck the North Atlantic that the Eastern Hemisphere had to deal with. It wasn't caused in the East Hemisphere. If you go back to 1997 with the Asian currency crisis, that was an Eastern phenomenon.
Yeah.
But the GFC was entirely North Atlantic, and Beijing dealt with that perfectly. And it's dealing with COVID perfectly.
What would you say to the critics who say that, naturally, politically, China is very different to the global West? Their ambitions have been hidden for a long time in what they actually want to do, and that is being a dominant power or the dominant power in the world to overtake the USA militarily, economically, with industry as well. And a lot of information coming out of China is very unreliable, whether it's their GDP figures, their development figures, their business growth figures, or even when they produce reverse mergers into US markets. A lot of Western and US accounting can't be applied to China because the Chinese government don't allow full audits of their accounts by Western institutions, which makes it very.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
I saw the evolution of national accounts coming from Greece, from Italy, from Ireland, from Spain, from Iceland. Accounts that were given AAA ratings from S&P and Moody's and Fitch. We now know they were fiction. So Europe was producing the same sovereign accounting pretense that you're claiming comes from China. I've seen corporate failure after corporate failure after corporate failure in North America and Europe. Where was Enron Chinese? Was Global Crossing Chinese? Was Wirecard Chinese? I could go on. Which I continue. So this perception that everything from China is fiction and fraud is absurd. As for its ambitions, militarily, China has one ambition, and that's monetary, not military. It can take over the world monetarily. So why waste sending soldiers in? Let's not forget that since 2002, China has earned in excess of $5 trillion of trade surpluses.
Mm-hmm.
And of those $5 trillion, it still has over 3 trillion in reserve. It spent 2 trillion. It has acquired Africa monetarily. It has acquired South America monetarily. It has acquired Central Asia monetarily. It's acquired the UK monetarily.
Yeah.
No need to send soldiers.
Yeah.
I
Naturally,
don't. What contribution has China made or Beijing made in the war in Syria in any meaningful way, or Yemen? None. Or Iraq?
yeah.
So this the barraging of Beijing with the claim that it has ambitions that are nefarious is not consistent with the facts. And all I deal with the facts rather than speculation. What's happening with China is that because China has an engagement with Iran, anyone who doesn't like Iran is throwing brickbats at China. So it's like know the narrative. Our job in finance is to be clinical, not to be duped. If anyone thinks that China has some sort of insidious role in the world, my only response is, if China isn't growing as strong as it is, there is no other part of the world that can provide global economic momentum. Europe is rubbish. North America or the US is flawed. India is still poorly managed. In fact, I often hear, why can't China be more like India and democratic? Where's the democracy in India? And as for China's ambitions, those who are old enough, as I am, to remember the Tiananmen Square riots, the
Yeah.
near collapse of the Chinese Communist Party. The reason the Chinese Communist Party has one ambition, which is sustained, robust growth, is because Beijing knows that the best pacifier to your population is wealth creation. China has a middle class which is growing as quickly as the population of Europe every year. Faster, in fact. There are 500, there are 500 million Europeans. There are 500 million middle class Chinese. And that number's growing.
If you'd like to hear this interview in its entirety, then head on over to SoundCloud, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, or any other major podcast platform and search Four Corners Podcast.